So, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for another live stream author talk with Goldfields Libraries and Library in Your Lounge Room. Now, we're very lucky to have Christie Nieman. That side, I have to remember. That's Christie Nieman with us tonight. Now, before we begin, I do want to go through the usual acknowledgement of country. So, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Dja Dja Wurrung land and pay my respects to any elders, past, present, emerging, who are watching. And if you're on any other land beside Dja Dja Wurrung, to pass on my respects for that as well. If you are standing on another land, if you want to even chat it into the chat box and let us know, that'd be great. I'm just going to admit at least one more person here. So this is live streamed on YouTube. If you're watching via Zoom, just remember to please turn your camera off and stay on mute until we are ready for you. Because this will be streamed to live YouTube and recorded. But yeah, will be an option for you to turn all that back on at the end and ask questions if you like. Otherwise, just put stuff in the chat box either on YouTube or in Zoom. So, very first thing, welcome, Christie.
Hello.
Hello.
Thanks for having me.
So you wrote a book, this one.
I did.
That's really good.
Let's wave it at each other. Woo!
Actually, one thing I should say before we go. This is actually really good, guys. You need to read this if you haven't. I love this book. It's really, really great. Do you want to tell us a little bit about where we begin?
Yes, okay. So where we begin is the story of a young woman who lives in inner city Sydney, city life, lives with her parents, has the boyfriend, is studying very hard. She's very studious, a bit of a swot. And then all of a sudden she takes off in the middle of her final year of school and travels through the day and the night to country Victoria, to Dja Dja Wurrung country, where we are, or where I am. She's in a bit of a state of distress. She leaves everything she's ever known, and she travels to the house of the grandparents that she's never met, and she's never really stopped to consider, in a way that maybe she should have, why she hasn't met these grandparents. And once there, she becomes enmeshed and tangled in the histories of both her family and the land that she's on. It's a bit of an awakening experience for her.
Yes. Now, so where we begin and your first novel, As Stars Fall, have both been described as Aussie Gothic, which I definitely see. But do you want to talk about what Aussie Gothic actually is? What do you see Aussie Gothic
as? So Gothic, this one, I was being quite intentional with the Gothic. This one was kind of accidental. Someone else called it that, and I went, "Oh, cool! I like that. I'm going to go with that." I feel like with this one, I've modelled it on those not Australian Gothics, more the old Victorian era Gothics of Europe, like the Brontes, like Jane Eyre and Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights and Daphne du Maurier's Jamaica Inn, etc. But I can give you a bit of a précis of where the Gothic came from. So the Gothic started in Europe, and it's a real reaction against that Enlightenment era where everything became practical and science-based, and it's stepping back into the world of mystery and examining all things dark and really preferencing emotions above all. It's all high-intensity emotions. If you've got a crumbling building, that's fantastic too. If you've got some moody weather, it's all about setting and mood. So it's all about landscape. The landscape is really infused in a Gothic novel. So that was all kind of burgeoning in Europe at the time that Australia was being invaded and colonised. And so, as good Gothic does, it tends to try and subvert the thing that came before. So Aussie Gothic tries to flip that a little bit. So it was Henry Lawson and Barbara Bainton work a lot in the Gothic, and they're really trying to buck off those age-old European traditions with this kind of Australian character, which they tried to infuse in it. But it's landscape, really. Landscape is the thing that defines it.
Yeah, well, landscape is definitely a big part of where we begin in particular. I mean, as Stars 4, it's almost the environment rather than the landscape, which is in some ways bigger. But
Yeah.
where we begin is almost based off a real place.
Yeah,
Pretty much.
it kind of is. I've tweaked things here and there to suit my purposes. But yes, it's that very high plateau between Castlemaine and Maryborough. It used to be a grasslands, but now it's being cleared for farming because it's a volcanic plain, so the soil's wonderful there. But if you drive across it, it's just this pretty incredible landscape. It's just flat with a really low slung sky, and then just these incredible old Gothic colonial buildings that just look like they've just been dropped. They're just sitting there, chunky, sitting up on the landscape. It's quite striking the way that you can see the layers of history as you drive across that plateau.
And layers is probably the best way both to describe this novel, and layers of history as well. I'm actually kind of in awe in the way that you layer the different themes of just trauma back here, echoing here, but both in the way the landscape has seen trauma and the way that the people have seen trauma and the way families have seen trauma and the way even just different buildings have seen trauma, and it all just works in really, really well. It's amazing. That's more me just saying nice things about you rather than asking you a question, isn't it?
You can do as much of that as you like. Go ahead. About that.
Okay, here's my question. How much of that was deliberate and how much of it came out in the writing?
It was definitely part of the germinal idea. I shouldn't say germinal in COVID times. The initial seed of the idea, to draw that kind of intergenerational trauma through a family and through people and through landscape and buildings. That was intentional. It took me 4 years to write it. So I think any success that you might see in my attempt to do that comes from just the sheer weight of time and rewriting. And I mean, that's the beauty of redrafting, is that you can see this bit over here and say, you know what, I could make that echo over here, and you can get in there and do your tweaking. So it reads beautifully, but you know, nuts and bolts.
Well, actually, on that, let's go off on that little tangent. I mean, you were writing this book for a long time. Do you want to talk about the process and why it took you a while to get through many drafts of this?
Sure. So I had 2 babies at once, and that tends to put the kibosh on creativity. The time became a bit of a thing. So Pan Macmillan published this one on a 2-book contract, and when this one came out at the launch, I was actually carrying 2 little humans on the inside. So at the same time this came out, my life changed incredibly. Also, my mother was very ill, so life really kind of did a bit of a pile-on. So we can take 2 years out of the equation because it's 6 years between books, and that's a long time between drinks in publishing, especially on a 2-book contract. Thank goodness for 2-book contracts. Who knows what would have happened if I wasn't, you know, contractually obliged to get up and work on another. But even once I started writing, it's so difficult to find sustained headspace to go deeply into something. So I think I did about 1 year's worth of writing in the 4 years that it took to write this. So it was a process of about 4 distinct drafts, with some fairly intense changes as things went along, even to the point where a week before print, my publisher wondered if I might want to rewrite the ending in that week. And I did. She's an excellent publisher and she knows what she's talking about. So when the email came through, I had a heart attack, but I also went, she's probably onto something, and she wouldn't ask me if she didn't think I could do it.
Yeah. And it wasn't even so much a rewrite as it was almost a refocusing. Like, you didn't change major aspects of the ending. You just kind of...
There was a whole final last scene that had to get pulled out and chopped up and distributed. It was it was a really good exercise in the ending helps you crystallize the thinking about what your novel is actually about, because it's very easy to just follow the plot line and try and tie it off in a plot way, whereas what you really want to do is tie it off in a plot and concept way. So what the weight of your novel is going to be. So it wasn't quite hitting the right concept weight at the end, if that makes sense.
So I'm more getting at the idea that you didn't change focuses, like you didn't change a twist or anything like
that. No plot change.
No, it was more you kind of smoothed the denouement a bit and made it ride a little bit nicer, but that meant a lot of work.
Yeah, it did. My poor family. That was a week.
Oh, no. Now, this is like, it's Gothic, so there's some real darkness in here, like super, super dark stuff. I do have to say that I found it surprisingly light at the same time. Like, there's joy and hope and struggle and redemption and real love, all that sort of stuff. Like, when we talk about Gothic novels, we tend to think of stuff like, the Jane Eyres and the Draculas and the Wuthering Heights. I hate Wuthering Heights with a passion because I hate almost every single character, whereas I like almost every single character in your book, which makes me...
Have you read Jane Eyre?
I love Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is one of my favorites.
So good. One of my favorites. And if you haven't read My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier, you must read that. That's amazing. So I just reread Wuthering Heights. I think I read it once ages and ages ago when I was a teenager, and my memory of it was quite dim. I totally understand what you're saying. All the characters are kind of awful, but the conceits of having the housekeeper tell the story, and then she's telling the story of something that someone else told her, like, it's just these layer and layer upon storytelling. So these characters are they're quite, they're written from the outside very much, whereas Jane Eyre is very much written from inside Jane. I think that's that's what I absolutely love about it, that kind of real intense emotion and that intimacy that we have with her and her struggles.
Yeah. I've described Jane Eyre as a book by introverts for introverts. It's just all very internal.
Yeah, and problematic race stuff, but excellent gender stuff, but also problematic gender stuff at the same time. So it's quite incredible that Gothic literature, that Victorian Gothic literature, has always been really close to my heart, despite its problems. Wuthering Heights is quite problematic around race as well, because it was that moment really when female characters in novels went from being these victims that had to be saved to actually being quite strong, full-bodied characters that worked their own way through their lives and made decisions. Kathy's in Wuthering Heights is quite an astounding character. She's quite complicated and strong and willful, and she doesn't really get a huge comeuppance for that specifically. So I have a real fellow feeling to those novels. And then yes, you need to accept and critique the Bertha Mason side of things and the Heathcliff side of things on race. It's not great.
But that's almost kind of where I was going with this. I mean, the contrast between or at least your version of Aussie Gothic, and some of these really dark old things. You've got many joyful characters. I mean, I'm not the only person to say it, but almost everybody who's read this book has fallen in love with Basil, who's one of the side characters. He's just a joy. Leone is
Side character,
everybody
but
wants Leone in their life, who's another one of the who's another major character. Um, but
so
they're just people. Lots of them are people you just want to be around, which isn't always true of Gothic. But I'd like I've been thinking a lot about the differences. You've done much more joyful characters. You were talking about Daphne du Maurier. I love Rebecca and Jane Eyre again. Both books that actually, like Jane Eyre and Daphne du Maurier, if you read them, are just subtextual sex, sex, sex. Whereas in a modern setting, you can talk about that outright. You don't have to have that
yeah,
subtextual stuff. Um,
that's right.
and just seeing the contrast, like, do you find that you can take that Gothic mode and do new things with it? Um,
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of my style, is to talk about the deep and the dark and the beautiful and the awful, and have real human humor in there, because I think it's as much a human trait as anything else. Um, so I certainly didn't feel inhibited by working in the Gothic to go there with Basil, and even with Leone. She cracks a few good jokes too. So Basil and Leone are a couple of Jara characters in the novel, and yeah, I think Basil actually turned up to lighten the mood. I think he was. I think he was getting a bit irritated about how all deep and dark it was all being, and how unmoving, because poor Anna is getting herself into quite a paralyzed state, really. And then he's just like a breath of fresh air. He flings open the windows of her, really. He just starts telling her all her inside stuff, and things move along.
He almost literally throws her on the back of his bike and drags her through the story. You're going to come do some things and find some secrets out.
Yes. Yes, he does. I don't know where that idea came from. I knew for quite some time that he was going to put her on the back of a bike and drive her around.
And again, that's another place where, I mean, you tend to have the dark brooding beauty of the moors, or the Gothic. I can't even remember what Rochester's house is in Jane Eyre.
Thornley, something like that.
That's Thornley, yes, but these big brooding things. But even then, at one stage, Basil takes you to this absolutely, well, actually takes you to a couple of beautiful spots. At one point, takes you to the top of the hill and just shows the beauty of the landscape to the reader, and he's very much the light in the story. It's great.
I was actually quite intentionally trying to, because I've got a bit of a beef with a lot of Australian Gothic, in that it suffers from a bit of a colonial trope of, it tries to put the threat, because Gothic fiction is literature plus tension, and to have tension you have to have a sense of threat, and a lot of stuff, even contemporary stuff, puts that sense of threat in the Australian landscape, like the wide open space fear. And it's very much that kind of early settler, this place is foreign and other and weird. And it's a colonial trope, and we kind of need to stop doing that. Like, even in contemporary things like Wolf Creek, and in The Natural Way of Things, Charlotte Wood, even, there's an incredible critique of that by Hannah Donnelly, who's an Aboriginal woman, saying that her lack of specificity and intimacy with the bush, that she kind of then makes into part of what she's creating this unsettling feeling with, it is quite alienating and quite white and quite settler and quite colonial. So in this, I was very, very careful and intentional to place all the sense of threat and unsettling feelings in the structures and the colonial things and the way the land is cleared, and rather than this kind of Australian bush as spooky Gothic place, because it's boring and old and
Yes.
and damaging. I think it's detrimental. I'm a real believer that what we put in our fiction matters because it reflects and reinforces how we think about things, and so how we think about our landscape. And if we think of it as something threatening, then we won't care so much when we pull down a forest.
Yeah. But you still do get the menace through, and it is often the talking of the wide open spaces or the giant cans of stones that have been moved that are dangerous enough to nearly kill somebody or actually kill somebody, or the big brooding building that's probably haunted. That Anna is still really intrigued by, because of course she's a rationalist. No ghost story's going to get her.
That's all the way.
But yes, no, I thought it was. I wanted to ask you about it because I think it's really interesting the way you've taken such a colonial sort of aspect. I mean, even in Jane Eyre, one of the problematic points is basically asking Jane, "Do you want to come and be a colonialist with us?" Whereas with this, you've got the landscape it's the clearing that's dangerous, and it's the built stuff that's dangerous. Whereas the natural landscape is beautiful, and if it's sad or dark, it's usually because tragedy's been imposed on it rather than the landscape bringing that itself.
That's actually kind of more in line with the original Victorian Gothic style, where because it's coming out of that romantic period, which was all about back to nature and a rejection of human civilization, there's a real romance and love and home feeling about the landscape. So Cathy and Heathcliff are out on the moors, that's their home. Jane Eyre, when she escapes from Mr. Rochester, she's out on the moor, and that's, you know, if it's not a place of safety, it's at least a place of refuge and respite. And in Australian Gothic, when, you know, the settlers came here, that got absolutely flipped. It got reversed, so that the civilized bits, the town, were the safety and the refuge, and the landscape was full of threat. So I'm trying to save Australian Gothic from itself. That's a big claim, isn't it? Saving Australian Gothic from itself. Just restoring it to that rightful romantic, in touch with those intense emotional lives, but also the landscape around.
Yeah, which is, I mean, definitely a theme through both books. I mean, as for some strange reason, birds, which I think was an accidental thing for you.
This one was, yeah. We've got lovely bush stone curlew here and lovely broggers here. So I'm pretty happy about that.
Sometimes the themes just turn up accidentally and you look smarter than you're meant to be. Now, I do have a question here from Mark, who's asking, what's the journey been to get to this point of writing full-length YA novels? How do you even start something like that?
Well, I've got bad news. I started this when I was 19. So that took me nearly 20 years to get into publication. I guess you just have a good look at if you really want it out there, and you put everything else aside. You've been cleaning up your house, like, don't come to my house.
Hey, this camera's pointed at this corner for a very good reason.
I'm not home, am I? I guess you just read, and if you feel compelled to write, then you just follow that. And it did take me a long time. Like, I'm quite a late bloomer, especially for a YA novel. I think I had to get my feet on solid ground before I could actually write it, and I don't think I had that for all of my 20s and start of my 30s. So I think reading a lot, seeing where you want to be, devoting time to it and attention, and being serious about it and calling yourself a writer even when you're not, and having people snigger. Um, and but that's all the psychological stuff. I do think that there is material stuff to consider, and I think it's quite a privileged position to find yourself in the position to be able to write a book. And it took me a while to get there, but yeah, I do acknowledge that.
I've got a question in the chat asking if you know the difference between Gothic and Romantic. How do you see the difference? The difference between the Gothics and the Romantics.
Well, there's Romantic Gothic and there's Gothic horror. So I don't think there's horror Romantic.
I don't know, didn't it? There's probably
I don't know, you might not.
Anita Blake might be that sort of stuff.
Twilight horror
Yeah,
romantic,
maybe that's horror romantic. Some of the deeper, darker depths of the internet probably have something like that.
So the Romantics, weren't they all like Percy Bysshe Shelley and those? Am I in the right place? So they weren't necessarily about the dark, and they weren't necessarily about that setting and the layers of history. That's what really gets me about the Gothic, is that kind of collision between there's always something hidden or something unexpected or unexplained or secret. And I don't think the Romantics have that so much. I think the Romantics are more about the celebration of nature, full stop.
Yeah. I mean, even though you have Mary Shelley kind of coming out of the same thing, she was more Gothic than Romantic. Oh, yeah. She was influenced by them, but then she took it in a different direction. That is a really great question. I was going to get to something similar anyway, but I'm going to ask this one. Can you tell us a bit about how you went about writing your Indigenous characters? Because there is a big Indigenous history factor to this novel, and that's a hard thing to write as a white person. And I know you were super careful about how you did it, but I'd love for you to explain what your consultation process was like and how you approached the whole process.
When I realized I was going to, it filled me with fear and trepidation, and I tried in any way I could to get out of doing it. But it seemed completely disingenuous to do that, and even cowardly to do that when I'm writing about a place, and so much of what I do is writing from writing out a place and layers of history. So like it
would be almost lying to leave that out. It'd be worse. Whitewashing.
It would be whitewashing. It would have been absolutely terrible. So knowing how much harm has been done in the representation of Aboriginal people by whiteys, well-meaning whiteys included, sometimes even worse. So I did a lot of reading about what Aboriginal writers had to say about white writers writing characters, and I really studied up, and I read, there's some amazing treatises by Tony Birch and Anita Heiss, and another very prominent First Nations writer, but I won't name her because the comments she was making were not public, but I really listened to what she had to say. So I did all of that, and I wrote my characters keeping a very careful eye on my own unconscious racism to just try and keep it, where I could see it as I was writing. But I knew that was never going to be enough. So I consulted with the Dja Clan's Aboriginal Corporation, getting permissions for any cultural material I was using, but I also made a decision to not really use any cultural material. I used one word, and I sought permission for that one word, simply because I think that's where appropriation starts happening, once we start taking and using the cultural material of First Nations people. I think writing characters is different, especially if we're writing them in a story that's critiquing whiteness and white Australia, which was always my aim. And once I had written those characters, I approached Auntie Kerry Douglas, who I have to absolutely thank. She was willing to be my consultant on that. So she made sure that I was not perpetuating any harms in my representations of those people. Yeah, so that's how I went about it, with lots of self-examination and fear and trepidation and zero hubris.
I mean, and speaking of hubris, I know it's not a story you're going to tell, so I'm going to say that I know at least one of the people who read the book cried because they were so happy with how you'd done at least one aspect of the character. So I know you're not going to say that, so I will say it for you. I know, just because if no people don't know, Christie and I do work together, so I've known for years that you've been working on this book, and I know how hard and carefully you worked on this aspect. It was a source of a lot of anxiety for you, I know, and just getting to a point where I know that you're finally happy with it, and that other people in consultation are finally happy with it, has been a big task and something you worked really hard on. So, well done.
Yeah, thank you. I feel really pleased that it's possible. Does that make sense? Because I think there is a lot of anxiety around it in writers, and I think it's so easy to avoid it. And Aboriginal people are, what are they, 0.2% of the population? So if all the weight is on Aboriginal people to include themselves in our cultural material, then we're just going to whitewash them. That's what's going to happen. So it's just finding through this process that it's possible. All you have to do is be really respectful, and yeah.
Because it is, as you say, it's even for well-meaning people, it's really easy to make mistakes as well. So you just have to try and do it the right way and work really hard at it.
And I will wear any issues that anyone has with it, because I need to take responsibility for the work 100% myself. So I got to the point where I felt comfortable with what I had done and my intentions, and how much collaboration I had done to then be responsible when people.
And I know that aspect's getting some praise from other people as well. So hopefully you've done it all right.
Yeah, so far has been very positive.
Yes. I do have another question here. So what drew you to writing for young people as opposed to junior fiction or adult novels? Or
I also write for adults. I haven't written a book yet. So I started writing this one when I was 19. So I think that goes a long way to explaining why. Because I was a young adult when I started writing it. Look, there's something really interesting about taking complex adult ideas to explicit adults in training, because I think we are all adults in training constantly. Once we hit that adolescence, it's just like learning for the rest of your life, pretty much. Well, I don't know. I'd have to ask some of the older people. So I think writing those complicated things in such an explicit way is quite interesting and exciting. So this book, it's got discussions of race and gender, and
there's some big topics.
alcoholism and post-traumatic stress, and just kind of learning to be good and empathetic humans. I think it's the work of life, and I think it starts at that point when you're an adolescent and you're really trying to find that line between your inside and the outside that you present to the world. And yeah, there's something really dynamic
Yeah,
about it.
that's part of the reason why I like young adult and why I recommend it to adults all the time is that young adult protagonists are at that point where they're dealing with the big issues, but they're totally innocent about them, so they have all that space to explore about it. So, whereas
And
when you're
it's
writing an adult character, you're often writing it from a already constructed place, whereas
yeah,
you can't necessarily explore all the avenues all at the same time where you can with a young person.
we get crusted on
Mm.
us adults. We create this exterior and then it hardens into the adult face that we show the world. Whereas working in that young adult thing, it's really dynamic and in flux, and yeah, it's
Yeah.
quite exciting.
We forget to stop pretending to be adults. We just keep doing it because we can't
Take
stop
our
it.
crust off.
Now, I've got one other question. Are the characters based off people you know?
I saw that one from Basil. That's a cheeky question. Oh, look, yes and no, of course. Yeah, I think I just have to say yes and no. So characters are always an amalgamation of people you know, people you invent yourself. So yes, there's family history in there, there's settings in there that I've of course come across in my life, and driving intentions in people. The villain is actually based on someone, but turned up to 11.
I
But
mean,
also,
even then, I know you changed the villain several times. So,
yeah, he's different to when he started, and I gave away I gave away.
Hopefully, no one will notice that little
All right.
split there. Next question.
No, I'm not judging this one without stumbling into it.
It is so hard, as we were saying just before the
Can't talk
stream
about
started. It's a novel about secrets, and it's so hard not to talk about the secrets because there's so many really cool things that come from them, but we can't talk about what they actually are. Do you? Oh, that's a super boring one I wrote, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Do you have a favorite Gothic novel?
Yeah.
Yeah.
My cousin Rachel, Daphne du Maurier. It's really, it's it's so interesting, and the characters are so well drawn, and the intrigue and the relationship between these two characters, it's absolutely electrifying. It's what keeps you kind of flipping. This is what I love about Gothic literature, and I can remember the first time I read Jane Eyre when I was about 14. I didn't sleep that whole night because I just stayed up and read and read and read, and that is the best definition I have heard of Gothic fiction. So I did a workshop with Dimitri Kakmi at Melbourne Uni about Gothic fiction, and he had a definition that was it's literature plus tension, and I really love that because with literature, with the high literary arts, you're able to talk about social issues and have really well fleshed out characters and really interesting and intricate and complicated relationships, and do all that heavy lifting that literature does, that highbrow literature. And then you add tension. So not only are you getting all of that, but it's a really gripping read as well, and you have to keep going and keep reading. So it kind of opens up the accessibility of what you're talking about and the ideas that you're talking about to a whole new set of readers, really. And I think My Cousin Rachel I was so stunned by it, by just how addicted I became to the relationship between these two people and the mystery of this other person, this kind of mysterious person who you don't know. It's about the not knowing. There's always a mystery in the not knowing. So yes, that's my favorite. I think.
Yeah, but so that actually brings up another thing. You don't just write young adult novels, you write essays and short stories, and you have collaborated on anthologies of, so far, mostly feminist topics. You have a very rich intellectual kind of life outside of young adult. How much of that do you try to bring in either deliberately, or does it just flow naturally from you when you're writing a young adult novel? Do you not dumb any of that down? You just throw it in and assume they're going to kind of catch up?
I just throw it in and wait for my editor to tell me that it's young adult, and she never did. So Claire at Pan Macmillan I think she's a fantastic believer in the intelligence of young people. I think young people know the minute you try and dumb something down for them or talk down to them. So I didn't reduce any of my thinking, and I'm a big one for concept tangents.
Some of my favorite parts of the book, actually.
Where I'll be in a scene and then kind of get stuck on an idea about, I don't know, skulls or something.
That's what I thought. The memento mori and all that sort of stuff is, great stuff.
Oh, yeah. Have you seen this, Stuart?
No, I was going to look it up because for anyone watching, the main character basically carries a massive picture of this from Sydney to the middle of country Victoria, that and a suitcase on a bus. And it just becomes a big theme for her because she's wanting to be a doctoral student. Yeah.
Sorry?
She wants to be a doctor.
This is the notebook that I started writing the book in when I started making notes. So there wasn't a memento mori in it, and then I just started writing from the picture on the front, and then it became quite an important part of the book. And I think that's how the character became someone who wanted to be a doctor. And then there's all sorts of thinking about the body and the way the body relates to the environment and to other bodies. And
yeah, I mean, even skulls are important throughout the novel, and it was a tangent you started on. So talk about that accidental layering stuff.
It was an accidental, so much starts off as an accident and becomes more and more intentional each time you visit it in the book as you write, I think.
So now you do talk about a couple of really big topics, and I think it's more a reaction to when I was a kid. Some of the stuff that's in here would have been almost taboo or risque even when I was younger. I don't think I'm that old. But I mean, one of the characters is dealing with the possibility of having an abortion, and it's just something they're dealing with. It's not seen as like you approach the topic in a very real world way. This is how some people would react to this, and so this is how other people would react to it, and this is how the character is thinking about it. It's not done in any way as to shock or titillate, and it's not done in any way to hide or to lecture. It's just something that's happening to this character, and I think you do that with a lot of really big subjects, or what I would have originally thought as a big subject may not be as big anymore. You were saying you didn't have pushback from your editor about any of these things you approached? No?
No. It's interesting because I think these things, to me, that approach seems only right. And I think that's the reality of women living in their bodies, or people with uteruses in their bodies. It's just a very real experience, I think, and all that taboo and all the politics kind of happens out there, and encroaches on the body and the person.
I mean, and even that you don't shy away from, but you don't. That's not the aspect you're playing on. That's almost the unimportant. It's like we shouldn't be that. Don't worry about that. Worry about
Well, I think that's the revolutionary
Mm.
thing to do, in a way, is to not buy into that really that patriarchal over observance and over policing of women's bodies. And actually, when I started writing the book, there was a scene that I had to change because I wrote it when abortion was still illegal in New South Wales, and most of the people who read the draft when it was in that mode and when abortion was illegal in New South Wales were absolutely shocked. Like, they had not realised that that was still the case. And then at the end of last year, a really concerted push happened to change that law, which then got through. So then I had to rewrite some of the book. But
Write
I mean,
faster next
yay.
time.
That's an interesting position to be in. Like, come on, the law needs to be kiboshed. I'm going to have to rewrite.
Another thing to rewrite.
But it was pretty shocking when I found out. That's why it ended up in the book, is because I was so shocked when I found out that there are women living in inner city Sydney who have no idea that that is actually against the law where they are. And it was quite horrifying to me. So no, my editor, there was no pushback, but my editor was just as shocked. She didn't realize that it was against the law there. So when I think she fact checked me. What? She can't be. Whoa. Yeah.
No, I mean, and I think that's probably the best turn to take with all of these important topics is the way you just present them. You don't necessarily have to moralize or.
Well, people experience them, and I think that's the beauty of fiction, is that you don't have to moralize or push a wagon. You just have to have a character who's really dealing with it. That's
Yes. The whole empathy thing.
If I want to moralize, I'll write an essay. And I have.
And you have. Awesome. Now, I did suggest to people where it would open it up to questions about this time. So if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask on camera, just from a reminder, we are recording this, so you'll be recorded and transmitted live. If you want to turn your camera on or ask a question just over mic, you can go for it now. You'll have to try and force your microphones back on. If not, put stuff in the chat, or I'm sure I can talk to Christie for another 20 minutes easily.
I have a. Has anyone got a question?
Not yet, but they may be typing or trying to fight the tech.
So I have written down here, it was kind of a guiding principle quote for the book, and it's a quote by Stan Grant, and it's quite amazing. It's from an article. I can't remember the name of it, but the quote is, "History is not dead. It is not past or redundant. It is alive in all of us. We are history." Just went. So that was pretty much, that was one of the guiding ideas and quotes.
Well, I mean, the book. There are lots and lots of layers of history. Like, I think I already said, there's the present history, and then how people got to here in this particular generation, and there's a section in 1996 of a previous generation, and then there's the generation before that with different traumas and different lives, and then there's even the history of the local landscape, and even some of the history of your fake landscape was based on some true research too. I mean, that there's a little bit with a pamphlet that I think is fascinating too. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
So I don't know what I was doing there. I was digitally wandering around in the archives of the State Library, as one does, and I found a pamphlet for the opening of a memorial in Maryborough, and it was by the founding fathers of the town, or to the founding fathers of the town. So I was reading actual quotes from this, and some of the language and some of it that belied their understanding of who they were and what they were doing there and what their aims were in that moment in time, in that place. It was quite astounding. So of course I had to actually pull chunks of it out and put them in the book to have characters, so real quotes, and have fictional characters respond to them. With our modern sensibilities. But it was quite a find, that little pamphlet.
But yeah, so just the whole idea of people coming in and imposing what they want to happen just echoes as one of the things that just echo through the book. I want this to happen, and I don't care how people get hurt.
It's kind of the central thread, I think, that entitlement and how it just bruises everything around it.
And how that then you have an impact from that, and then an impact from the impact, and then the trauma doesn't stop just there. It's still hurt stuff, even that's from that pamphlet, that attitude itself is hurting characters who are still alive today.
Well, I think that came from my attempt to understand intergenerational trauma, because it's a concept that is talked about a lot now, and I think we need to learn to understand it if we are to positively reckon with our own white history. So I was trying to get my head around intergenerational trauma and how it worked. So I did lots of reading about that as well.
It is almost very much intergenerational trauma, the book. It's great, just the different layers and different aspects and the different ways it affects character and relationship is really great.
I read in 1999, which was super fun. No, 1996. And read all the music.
I'm half convinced you wrote the 1996 section just so you could throw your own personal music tastes in.
It was kind of a relief, because I just got to write from my own memory and experience. Everything else is kind of research laden and contemporary stuff.
So let's write some teenagers in 1990 listening to music.
That's right. It's like I could just write from my mind.
I have two questions I think we might have time for. First one is, what point did you have your plot in mind? Did it come to you full formed, or did you have to work on it?
A bit from column A and a bit from column B. So I got the very first plot idea driving across that plain and seeing that big bluestone ruin that's there between Castlemaine and Maryborough, and just driving across there. And I'd been parenting two babies for 16 months, and I think it was just like I just woke up when I saw that building, and the first idea about a young woman arriving in that area from somewhere else and seeing that building and seeing a light on at night. That was it. The rest of it grew piecemeal, like a magpie. You collect things and draw things in, and once a novel gets that first little roll on, I've just started writing my third, so I know this feeling now. You get that first little roll on, and then it just starts drawing in matter. Yeah, so that's.
So it's a process rather than that doesn't just appear full formed, but
no, definitely not. And it's quite long, so that would be quite a complicated thought.
Yes. Lots of things to balance.
I like to think of writing a novel as having that first idea, and then it's just problem solving from that point on, because every next step has all sorts of problems and issues and inconsistencies, and you have to get through that to the next bit. Yeah.
Awesome.
That's quite a boring man of writing a book.
What's the closest thing to where do you get your ideas from with But I've actually, it's the closest thing to an answer to that question I've heard. You start off with one and they just grow.
Yeah.
Um, I do have a good one from Caitlin. So you've written a book that's grounded in place, but everyone's relationship to place is kind of changed at the moment when we're in a pandemic and we're all stuck in certain places. And how do you think readers might be reacting to something that's so rooted in travel and broad landscapes and
Well, I hope they feel like a bit relieved to have some space. Just an essayist to ask such a complicated and insightful, intelligent question. And I think that, I don't know, this essayist should maybe write an essay. I would read the hell out of that.
You do the analysis, essayist.
Look, in the publishing world at the moment, I'm seeing two things. I'm seeing agents and publishers saying, I don't want anything about coronavirus. I want fun. I want romance. I'm not very interested in that as a concept. I quite like the idea of, it's such a strange moment, especially to be launching a book into. I would hope that it reminds people that the landscape is still there for them. It's still there. It's not going anywhere. And I think that was the experience that I had after having the babies and being locked in for 18 months and then driving out, and the landscape, it was like it was there waiting for me. And yeah, I was out in it again. So we'll get there. It's still there. We can read about it.
Oh, and something I've been asking, like, we both work in Castlemaine where there's a billion authors. When it comes up in topics, I've been asking lots of our local authors, and I'll ask you too what your feelings are about, outside what agents and publishers are asking, what are your feelings on trying to approach this time as a writer? I mean, it's obviously a big, significant thing, and ignoring it would be a bit like ignoring the Jazz Age. But at the same, if F. Scott Fitzgerald just went and wrote, no, I'm just going to go and write some nice fiction that has nothing to do with the Jazz Age, it's just happening. But at the same time, it feels temporary. Do you feel like you need to engage with it, or you might engage with it later when you've had time to reflect, or might you ignore it entirely because it's not impacting you in ways that are important to your particular fiction? Or
my feeling at the moment is a wait and see kind of feeling. So I'm working on a book at the moment, and when all this happened in March, it was like, do I have to write this into this book? And I think writers everywhere did the same thing. They looked at the manuscript they were working on and said, this isn't reality anymore. So I have done a tricky little thing in my head and with the book that I'm writing, in that I can put the coronavirus thing to one side, but I can include it later if I need to. I don't feel the need to engage with it at the moment. I'm seeing this time as a time to stop driving so hard and stop pushing forward and stop commenting and commentating and just breathe a bit. That's kind of, well, not on other people, obviously.
Behind a mask.
Behind a mask. So that's how I'm seeing it. But then again, I have one finished work in the world and another work just started. So I'm not in a position where I need to be writing at the moment. And also, if rumor and hearsay is to be believed, didn't Shakespeare write some of his historical plays when he was quarantining the plague? And there's like one or two lines that mention the plague in those plays. So I think you're right. It does feel temporary, and I want to just work on the things that I'm thinking about and obsessed with at the moment. So.
And I think we've probably got time for one last question, and again, another forward-facing question. Is the one you're working on at the moment young adult or adult or junior?
I have a nugget of a young adult, which I've put to the side while I work on a nugget of an adult, and I'm going to see where I am. Yeah. so that's where I am. Yes, I'm straddling the fence at the moment. Don't really. But I think I'm gonna give the adult one a bit of a nudge.
Amazing. Awesome. Well, I think that's pretty much all we have time for. So thank you everybody for joining us, both in Zoom and on YouTube. And thank you very much, Christie, for being with us. Now, I will also mention that Christie was just talking about how Tony Birch was one of the people she was researching. We have Tony Birch coming for an author talk in a few weeks, so check out our Eventbrite page for that. We have another local author, Catherine McKinnon, coming to talk about her non-fiction book, Birthing Work, is all about the different impacts of giving birth, like social and medical and personal, all that sort of stuff. She's had some amazing research and she talks about it really well, so you'll keep an eye out for that as well. And thank you all for joining us. And once again, thank you, Christie.
Thank you. Thanks, Goldfields, for having me.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.